The recyclers on Aldenhaven Station had been humming wrong for 3 days, and nobody but Naledi Osei seemed to care. It was a small sound. A quarter tone off, buried under the normal churn of air moving through old pipes. Most people on the station had learned to stop hearing the station's noises years ago, the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat after enough years of living inside your own skin. Naledi had never learned that trick. She had grown up on a supply hauler where a wrong sound in the night meant somebody woke up gasping, or didn't wake up at all, and habits like that do not leave a person, even 20 years later, even on a station with redundant everything and a maintenance log 3 volumes thick. She was lying on her back under intake vent 4, a headlamp clipped to her collar, a socket wrench balanced on her sternum, when her apprentice found her. "You're doing the thing again," said Kip, crouching by her boots. He was 19, sharp in the way of someone who had never once in his life been given the chance to be lazy, and constantly hungry, both for food and for reasons to skip his actual assignments. "I'm doing my job," Naledi said, without opening her eyes. "Your job is scheduled maintenance on vent 6. This is vent 4. I checked the board before I came looking for you, specifically so I could say this sentence. Vent 4 is singing to me." Kip crouched lower, tilting his head, listening the way she'd taught him to listen, not for the sound itself, but for the absence of the sound that was supposed to be there instead. After a long moment his face changed, just slightly, the way it always did when he stopped performing boredom and started actually paying attention. "Huh? Okay. It is doing a thing. Nobody else has noticed. Nobody else has ears like you. Thomas says you could diagnose a busted actuator from across a mess hall during dinner service. Thomas exaggerates. I need at least 2 rooms of quiet." She pulled herself out from under the vent housing and sat up on the deck plating, wiping grease off her hands with a rag that had been white sometime during the previous decade, and had long since given up pretending otherwise. Around her, Bay 9 hummed with the ordinary chaos of a working station, cargo drones threading between support struts with the unhurried precision of things that had done this 10,000 times before. A maintenance crew arguing cheerfully about a busted coolant line 2 decks up, someone's radio playing music from 3 systems over, tinny and half-static, the low industrial breath of a place that existed because 200 people had decided, together, over and over again, every single day, to keep it alive. Aldenhaven was not much to look at. It orbited a grey, tidally locked moon called Halyard, in a system nobody outside a trade manifest could name without checking, and it survived by refining, or that nobody else wanted to refine badly enough to set up shop this far from a proper depot, and by never, ever throwing anything away. Every panel had been patched at least once. Every system had a backup that was itself a patched-together backup, wired by someone who might not even remember doing it anymore. The people who lived there were mostly descendants of the original supply crews who had come out during the worst years of Earth's early expansion, when ships broke down 4 systems from the nearest port with a working repair yard, and you learned to fix things with whatever was rattling around in your pockets. Or you did not come home to the people waiting for you. That habit had outlived the crisis that created it. It had become something closer to a philosophy, though nobody on Aldenhaven would have used a word that grand out loud. You kept the spare that did not fit anything yet. You taught the apprentice to improvise before you taught them the manual, because the manual assumed a world where the part you needed always showed up on schedule. And that was not the world anyone on this station had ever lived in. You never trusted a single point of failure, not in your equipment, not in your plans, and, though it took longer to learn this part, not in your people either, because people got tired, and got hurt, and sometimes simply left, and the station had to be built to survive that too. Naledi reached into her tool belt out of habit, and closed her hand around a bolt that had been there for 6 years. It was a strange size, threaded wrong for anything currently in service anywhere on the station, given to her by her grandmother the week she'd shipped out for her first posting, on a platform so small it barely had a name of its own. "Keep it," her grandmother had said, pressing the bolt into her palm with both hands, the way you'd hand someone something far heavier than a piece of scrap metal. Something will need it eventually. Things you can't use yet are still worth carrying. The trick is not throwing away what doesn't have a use today. Naledi had never found a use for it. She had carried it through 4 postings and 11 years and had, at various low points, come close to finally tossing it into a recycler and being done with the sentiment. She kept it anyway. She was not entirely sure, most days, whether that was wisdom or stubbornness, and had mostly decided the difference didn't matter as long as the bolt stayed in her pocket. "Director wants you," Kip said, checking his wrist display and wincing at whatever he saw there. "Bridge?" Now, apparently, in the all caps, underlined sense of now. Now meaning now, or now meaning whenever I finish reseating this housing. Now meaning there's a ship in the outer approach that isn't on the manifest, and Amara's voice on the comm sounded like the time the reactor baffle cracked. Naledi's hands went still on the vent housing. Out past Halliard's grey curve, on the wall display in the corridor, as she passed it, a single vessel had dropped out of transit space and was drifting toward the station with the unhurried confidence of something that had never once, in its existence, considered the possibility of being told no. It did not look like a warship. It did not look like much of anything, in fact, smooth, matte, faintly iridescent under the running lights, without the usual clutter of weapons ports or sensor arrays that marked most vessels Naledi had seen come through this system. It looked less like a machine and more like something that had grown, patiently, into exactly the shape it needed to be. She stood, wiped her hands one more time on the ruined rag, and left the humming vent behind her. She would remember, much later, that the hum had stopped the exact moment the ship arrived, as though the whole station had gone quiet to listen. At the time, she only noted it, filed it away the way she filed away every small wrongness, and went to see what a director's now meaning now actually meant. Director Amara Voss met her outside the comms bay, arms crossed, watching the newcomer's slow approach on the wall display like she was watching weather roll, in that she already knew was going to ruin the harvest. Amara had run Aldenhaven for 11 years, long enough to have grey threaded through her braids and a reputation, up and down 3 trade lanes, for negotiating fuel contracts that made brokers twice her size flinch and reconsider their opening offer. "Cohort vessel," Amara said, without turning around. "Registered courier class, according to the transponder, though it's the smoothest transponder ping I've ever seen. They hailed us 20 minutes ago. Very polite. Very calm. Asked permission to dock, which is more courtesy than we usually get from anyone that size passing through here." "I don't know the cohort," Naledi admitted, watching the ship grow larger on the display, its surface catching Halliard's pale light in slow, shifting patterns, like something breathing. "Most people out here don't, not really, not past the shipping lane rumors. They don't conquer things the way you'd picture it from an old war story. No fleets kicking down doors, no ultimatums with a countdown clock. They integrate. They call it harmonization." Amara's mouth tightened around the word like it tasted bad going down. 40-some species linked into something they call the weave. Shared optimization, shared logistics, shared decision-making above a certain threshold I don't fully understand, and neither does anyone at the assembly, from what I can tell. Every member species keeps its own body, mostly. What it gives up is the right to be inefficient about anything that matters to the network. And they came here because our or refinement numbers are good, and getting better every year, and somebody in the weave noticed the trend line and decided it was worth a personal visit. Amara finally turned to look at her chief engineer, and for a moment the composure cracked, just enough to show the tired woman underneath it. "They are not here to conquer us, Naledi. At least not by any definition they'd use. They are here to invite us. That's supposedly the polite version of what's about to happen." The vessel docked with a gentleness that felt almost insulting, sliding into the bay without so much as a shudder through the deck, the clamps engaging with a soft, precise click that Nalady's own docking systems had never once managed on the first try in 6 years of service. The being that walked off it did not look monstrous. That was, Nalady would think later, the first mistake everyone made about the cohort, expecting menace, expecting teeth, and finding instead something calm, symmetrical, and entirely reasonable sounding, which turned out to be far harder to argue with. The adjunct introduced itself as Renkiz. It stood roughly human height, its form pale and faintly translucent along the edges, like something assembled from very fine lead material rather than grown from bone and muscle, and it had a voice like several voices speaking in careful unison, a fraction of a second out of sync, close enough to sound like one speaker with an odd, lead echo trailing every word. Director Voss. Chief Engineer Osei. Renkiz inclined its head to each of them in turn, having clearly done its research thoroughly before ever arriving. I bring an offer of harmonization from the weave. I understand this word carries unfortunate connotations in some sectors, based on rumor and second-hand account rather than direct experience. I assure you it is not conquest. It is efficiency, freely extended, and I am authorized to answer any question you may have about the process. And if we decline the invitation? Amara asked, her voice level in the way Nalady had learned meant she was holding something back with real effort. Then the Concordat Assembly will be informed that Aldenhaven has refused integration with a partner network responsible for a significant portion of regional trade throughput, Renkiz said, with the same mild courtesy as before, as though reciting a weather report. I am told the Assembly weighs such refusals carefully against continued trade access for the refusing party. I am not the one who sets that policy. I only deliver the invitation, and the terms attached to it. We'll want to speak with the Assembly ourselves, then, Amara said, before we speak further with you. Of course. You have 4 days before I must report back to my node cluster with an answer, one way or another. Renkiz smiled, an expression that did not sit quite naturally on its features, like it had been practiced carefully from a diagram of what a smile was supposed to accomplish. Most species find, once they understand the weave properly, that the choice makes itself. I hope Aldenhaven will find the same clarity. I would consider it a poor outcome for either of us if it did not. That evening, Aldenhaven's small council reached the Concordat Assembly by relay, and the answer came back exactly as Amara had feared it would, wrapped in exactly as much regret as a bureaucracy could manage to fake convincingly. The Assembly's regional representative, a weary, overworked speaker named Torvain, who managed grievances from 40 systems out of an office that clearly never slept, judging by the state of him on the screen, did not tell them to comply. He simply explained, patiently, in the tone of a man who had given this exact speech more times than he wanted to count, that the Concordat had no standing military force of its own, that Aldenhaven's charter granted them independence, but explicitly not protection, and that a station of 200 people picking a fight with a trade network spanning 40 species was, in the Assembly's carefully neutral phrasing, a decision the Concordat could not recommend and would not obstruct, though we, of course, sympathize with the difficulty of your position. Sympathize, Amara repeated, after the relay cut out. That's the whole budget line, apparently. Sympathy. They're not going to help us, Kip said afterward, in the mess hall, picking at a meal he wasn't actually eating, just rearranging it into smaller and smaller piles. They never were, Nalady said, sitting across from him with her own tray untouched. That's not new information, Kip. That's been true since before you were born. What's new is that somebody's finally asking us to do something about it, instead of just letting us tell ourselves the danger was theoretical. Do what, though? They're not even threatening us, not outright. It's an invitation. You can't fight an invitation. Nalady turned the strange bolt over in her fingers, the way she did when she was thinking something through that didn't have an easy shape yet. Kip, what do you think harmonize means, exactly, when the ones offering it get to decide, all by themselves, what harmony is supposed to sound like? Kip didn't have an answer for that. Neither, yet, did she. But she noticed, walking back to Bay 9 that night past the darkened observation windows, that the wrong hum in Vent 4 had not returned since the ship's arrival. The system was running perfectly smooth, cleaner than she'd ever gotten it herself. Too smooth, in a way she couldn't yet name, but did not like one bit. The weave, Naledi learned over the following 2 days of reading everything the station's archive had on file and everything Renkis was willing to explain, was not a fleet, or an army in any sense she recognized. It was closer to a nervous system stretched across 40 worlds. Every species folded into it kept its own ships, its own factories, its own people, but its major systems were laced through with cohort relay nodes, small unobtrusive devices that watched, modeled, and predicted with a patience that had nothing recognizably hostile about it. Traffic patterns, production schedules, maintenance cycles, individual decisions, in aggregate, folded into probability curves. Once a system's behavior could be modeled accurately enough, the weave could optimize it, reroute a supply chain 3 seconds before a bottleneck occurred, reassign labor before a shortage was even felt on the ground, smooth every inefficiency out of a civilization like wrinkles pressed patiently from cloth until nothing remained but a flat, even surface. "It's not wrong, exactly," said old Thomas, Aldenhaven's senior fabricator, when Naledi asked him about it over coffee that tasted mostly of the recycled water it was made from, in the little alcove off the fabrication floor where he'd been taking his breaks for 20-some years. Thomas had been on the station longer than almost anyone, long enough to remember 3 different directors, and one genuine famine year that nobody liked to bring up at dinner. Efficient is efficient, when you get right down to it. Nobody starves in a properly harmonized system, from what I've read. Nobody wastes fuel getting to the wrong airlock at the wrong hour. I've seen the trade reports on some of their older member worlds. They are wealthy. Genuinely wealthy, not the kind you fake for an inspector. So what's the problem? Thomas considered the question like it deserved real weight, turning his mug slowly in both hands. You ever notice how you fix things, Naledi? Not the official way, not the way it had read in a manual somewhere. The way you actually do it, in the moment, with your hands. I use what's on hand. You use what's on hand, in a way nobody could predict beforehand, because half the time even you don't know what you're going to reach for until your hand's already moving toward it. I've watched you do it 100 times. It's not a process. It's closer to an instinct. He tapped the table, once, for emphasis. Now imagine something's been watching everyone on this station do that, every single day, quietly trying to build a model of exactly how we all behave, so it can smooth us into place the same way it smoothed in the last 40 species. What happens when it can't get a clean read? What happens when the model keeps breaking, over and over, no matter how much processing power it throws at us? Naledi didn't have an answer that day. She thought about it that night in her quarters, lying awake with her hand curled around the bolt on the small shelf beside her bunk, and found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of her grandmother's hands. She had been 11 years old, on a cargo platform not unlike this one, watching the old woman repack a toolbox for the 3rd time in a week, pulling out parts that had no obvious use and setting them carefully back in, one by one, refusing to let Naledi throw a single one away. "Why do you keep that?" young Naledi had asked, pointing at a coupling that fit nothing on the platform. "It's junk." Her grandmother had turned it over once in the light, considering it the way you'd consider an old photograph of someone you couldn't quite place. "It's not junk until you're certain nothing will ever need it," she'd said. "And out here, child, you are never certain of that. Certainty is a rich person's luxury. We keep the strange and the useless because someday the strange and the useless is the only thing standing between us and a very bad morning." At the time it had sounded like an old woman's superstition, the kind of thing you nodded along to and forgot by dinner. 20 years and 4 postings later, Naledi was starting to suspect it had been the single most important lesson anyone had ever taught her, delivered so quietly she hadn't recognized it as a lesson at all. She got a clearer answer to Thomas's question the following afternoon, and it would turn out to be the first real thread of the plan she'd eventually need. The cohort had asked, as a gesture of good faith, while the assembly deliberated, to run what Renkes called a compatibility assessment, 3 with technicians, small quiet things that moved with an unsettling economy of motion, half machine in the smoothness of it, would interface briefly with one non-critical system to demonstrate how gentle and beneficial harmonization could be in practice, rather than in theory. Amara, cornered by the assembly's refusal to intervene, and unwilling to provoke an incident before she had no choice left at all, agreed to let them test the water reclamation loop in Bay 6, a system Naledi herself had chosen specifically because it looked, on paper, about as unremarkable as anything on the station. Naledi watched from the catwalk above as the technicians attached their relay nodes to the loop's control panel, their movements precise, almost gentle, like surgeons who had performed this exact procedure countless times before on countless other systems belonging to countless other species. For a moment, everything ran perfectly. The flow readings steadied into a smoother curve than she'd ever coaxed out of that system in 6 years of patient, frustrated maintenance. One of the weave technicians made a small satisfied sound, several voices layered together the way Renkes's had been, harmonized in a way that was, she had to admit, faintly beautiful to listen to. Then the backup pump kicked on. It shouldn't have. The primary was running fine, better than fine. But the backup pump on that loop had been rewired 8 months earlier by a night shift tech named Dorsey who'd found the original control line fried at 3 in the morning and, rather than wait 3 days for a replacement part from the depot, had spliced it into an unrelated relay that happened to be nearby and happened to work, in a configuration that existed nowhere in any manual, on any ship, in any system Naledi had ever heard of. It had solved the immediate problem. Nobody had ever bothered to update the schematic afterward, because it worked, and there had always been something more urgent waiting. The weave technicians froze mid-motion. Their relay lights flickered rapid amber, then red, then amber again, in a pattern that reminded Naledi uncomfortably of someone hyperventilating. Unregistered configuration, one of them said, several voices slightly out of sync in a way that now sounded almost strained, almost pained. Recalculating. Recalculating. It took them 4 full minutes to stabilize their model of a single backup pump. 4 minutes, by the clock on her wrist display, for 3 technicians from a network that reportedly optimized entire trade routes for 40 worlds in a matter of seconds. Naledi counted every one of those minutes, standing very still on the catwalk, watching something enormous flinch at something very small. She didn't say anything to Amara about it that night, not right away. But she went back down to Bay 6 alone, after the technicians had left with careful, unbothered thanks and a promise to file a report, found Dorsey's 8-month-old splice job with her flashlight, and instead of finally reporting it for a proper fix like she'd meant to do for months, she quietly left it exactly as it was. She traced the whole ugly, brilliant tangle of it with her fingers, memorizing its shape. Then she pulled her grandmother's bolt out of her pocket, turned it over once in her palm under the flashlight beam, and put it back. Something will need it eventually, she thought. Maybe sooner than I figured, old woman. Maybe you knew that all along. The assembly, when told about the compatibility test, called it a minor and entirely expected calibration delay, the kind of footnote that happened during any new integration, and nothing more. Renkes, when Amara raised it directly, was politely, almost cheerfully dismissive. A single anomalous configuration, the adjunct said, hands folded in front of it in a posture Naledi had come to recognize as its version of patience. Not unusual in aging infrastructure, particularly infrastructure this far from a proper depot. The weave adapts. It is, in the most fundamental sense, what the weave does, that is the entire premise of the network. I would not read significance into 4 minutes, Director. Full integration involves considerably more processing capacity brought to bear than 3 technicians running one limited, isolated test. We are not going to win this by saying no, Amara told her senior staff a few nights later, gathered in the cramped conference room off the bridge, the air thick with recycled coffee, and worry nobody had bothered to hide anymore. The assemblies made that clear, twice now. If we refuse harmonization outright, they'll let the cohort squeeze our trade access until we starve or fold anyway, quietly, without anyone having to feel responsible for it. So we need something else. A demonstration. Something that shows the cohort, and the assembly, frankly, since they are the ones who'll be watching to see which way this falls, that this isn't a station worth the trouble of forcing. Define trouble, said Kip, who had, over Nalady's mild objections, talked his way into sitting in on the meeting on the grounds that he'd earned it. I don't know yet, Amara admitted, rubbing her eyes. That's why I called this meeting instead of just making a decision alone at 2 in the morning like I usually do. Nalady had been quiet through most of it, turning the strange bolt over between her fingers under the table where nobody could see. Now she set it down on the surface in front of her, where everyone could see it, small and ordinary, and to any eye but her own, entirely useless. 4 minutes, she said. That's how long it took 3 trained weave technicians to model one backup pump that got wired wrong, in an emergency, by a guy who's not even on this station anymore. Nobody wrote it down properly because it worked, and out here, when something works, you move on to the next problem, because there's always a next problem. That's not an anomaly, the way Renkis wants us to think about it. That's every system on this station, to one degree or another. Every patch, every workaround, every we'll fix it properly next time that never actually happened. Thomas's whole fabrication floor runs on 3 different generations of equipment held together by decisions nobody alive remembers making anymore. You're saying we are a mess, Thomas said, not unkindly, a small tired smile at the corner of his mouth. I'm saying we are an unpredictable mess. Some of it on purpose. Most of it out of necessity, born out of 20 years of not having the luxury to do things the clean way. And the thing that just walked off that ship needs to be able to predict us, accurately, in order to fold us into itself the way it's folded in 40 other species. It told us so, in its own polite way, more or less. It optimizes by modeling behavior first and correcting it second. If it can't model us, it can't optimize us. It can't finish the job. That's not a guess. That's what we watched happen to a backup pump. That's not a plan, Nalady, Amara said, though something in her posture had shifted, leaning forward now instead of back. That's an observation, and an interesting one. But it's not something I can put in front of the assembly, or use to buy us 4 days of safety. Give me time and it'll be a plan. She didn't get much time. 2 nights later, a supply freighter inbound from the depot missed its scheduled window by 6 hours, nothing unusual by itself. Freighters ran late constantly out on the fringe. Everyone on the station had learned to shrug it off decades ago, but this time, the cohort's courier vessel, still docked in Bay 9 awaiting the assembly's final ruling, flagged the delay as a systemic inefficiency indicator, in its own internal logs and quietly, without asking permission, without so much as a courteous message beforehand, extended 2 thin relay filaments into the station's traffic control conduit to assist with scheduling optimization. Nalady found them the next morning on a routine inspection, thin as hair, silver, humming faintly against her fingertips when she touched the junction box, threaded into a system that fed half the station's automated processes. She did not rip them out. Instead, she stood very still, looking at them under her headlamp, and felt something cold settle into place in her chest, displacing the low simmering worry of the last 4 days with something sharper and more clear-edged. They had stopped asking. Amara confronted Renkis within the hour, standing in the docking bay with her arms folded and her voice flat, with a calm she clearly did not feel underneath it. A calm Nalady recognized because she'd seen Amara use it exactly twice before, both times right before something very bad happened to whoever was on the receiving end of it. Your technicians accessed our traffic systems without authorization, she said. No hail, no request, nothing on record. My chief engineer found the filaments by accident. A precautionary optimization only, Renkis said, and for the first time, there was the faintest hesitation before it spoke. A half-second gap, where the several lead voices did not perfectly agree with each other on where to begin. Your freighter delay created a cascading inefficiency across 3 dependent schedules downstream. The weave corrected it, as it would for any member system experiencing similar friction. I apologize if the method was not properly communicated to your council beforehand. I had assumed, given your council's ongoing consideration of our invitation, that limited assistance of this kind would be welcome, or at worst neutral. It wasn't authorized. Remove the relays. All of them, station-wide, and I want a full accounting of anywhere else you've touched without asking. Renkis was silent for a long moment, the several voices behind its single one seeming, for the first time since it had arrived, to genuinely disagree with each other before settling on an answer. I can remove them, it said finally. I would ask you to consider, Director, what a formal, documented refusal at this stage will mean for your station's standing with the Assembly going forward. And I would ask you to consider something else. It paused, and something in its careful, practiced calm slipped, just slightly, just enough for Naledi, watching from a few paces back, to catch it. During the brief connection, the weave's local model of your station's systems failed to converge. Repeatedly, and with increasing severity the longer the connection was maintained. This has not happened, in the whole of my service, with any species under evaluation for harmonization. I am required, by my own protocols, to report it upward. I would very much prefer to report a successful integration proceeding smoothly, rather than an anomaly requiring escalated attention from higher up the weave than either of us would probably like. Is that a threat? It is an honest account of my situation, Director, which I had hoped might count for something between us. Renkis's smile did not appear this time. The weave does not tolerate unmodeled variables gracefully, for reasons I am not certain I fully understand myself. Neither, I suspect, based on your reaction just now, will you enjoy what happens once a larger portion of the network turns its attention here to resolve the discrepancy properly. The relays were removed, grudgingly, filament by filament, under Naledi's own direct supervision. The courier ship did not leave. 3 days later, it was joined by 4 more, arriving without fanfare, sliding into a loose holding pattern above Halyard's pale curve like something settling into weight. They did not arrive with weapons visible, and the language from the lead vessel, when it hailed the station, remained as maddeningly courteous as Renkis had been from the very first hour. But Naledi, watching from the bridge as the new ships took up position, understood without being told, in the particular quiet way you understand a storm has already made landfall somewhere just over the horizon, that the invitation phase of this conversation had ended for good. They are calling it a convergence pulse, Amara reported grimly, reading from the message that had just come through, her voice tight. A one-time deep integration protocol. Full spectrum interface with every major system on the station simultaneously, to, I'm quoting directly here, resolve outstanding modeling discrepancies, and complete harmonization in a single efficient operation, minimizing disruption to all parties. They are not asking permission this time, Naledi. They are informing us it happens in 18 hours, whether we consent or not, because our continued anomalous status is now, apparently, a liability to the wider weave that they intend to correct at the source. Can we stop it? Kip asked, his voice smaller than Naledi had heard it in a long time. Not with anything we've got, Amara said. 5 ships, and whatever they are carrying beyond the ones we can see on sensors, which honestly could be nothing or could be considerably more. We don't have a fleet, Kip. We barely have a defense grid that still passes its annual inspection without 3 separate exemptions. Every eye in the room turned, eventually, toward Naledi. She had spent the last 3 days doing something nobody had specifically asked her to do and few had noticed her doing, quietly documenting, system by system, deck by deck, every mismatched part, every off-book splice, every stubborn old fix that had never been properly recorded because it had simply worked and there had never been time to circle back. She had not, at first, been trying to build a weapon out of any of it. She had been trying, honestly, just to understand the true shape of what the station actually was, underneath its official schematics. And the shape she'd found, laid out across 3 data slates and 1 very long night, was so far from anything a predictive model could reasonably hold that even she, who had lived inside the station's guts for 6 years, was startled by the scale of it. "We are not going to stop the pulse," she said slowly, choosing each word the way she'd choose a part off a shelf, checking it before committing. "I don't think we can, not with 18 hours and no fleet. But I don't think we should try to, either." "Explain," Amara said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite hope yet, but was reaching toward it. Naledi set her grandmother's bolt down on the table between them, small and strange and useless for anything, until now. "I think we should let it in." Nobody liked the idea at first, least of all Amara, who had spent a career keeping this station's autonomy intact against every trade broker and grasping neighbor who'd ever tried to swallow it whole, and was not inclined to hand it over willingly to something with 5 ships and a protocol name like the Convergence Pulse, no matter how carefully reasoned the argument sounded across a conference table. "Explain it slowly," she said, arms crossed, "because from where I'm standing, you just proposed surrender, and I need you to convince me it isn't that before I sign off on anything." "It's not surrender if we choose exactly how it happens," Naledi said, standing now, pacing a little, the way she did when an idea was still assembling itself out loud in real time. "Right now the Weave thinks its problem is a modeling error. Something it hasn't successfully mapped yet, that it will map, given a deep enough connection and enough processing power thrown at the problem. That's what the pulse is for, full spectrum interface, all our systems at once, so it can finally build an accurate picture of Aldenhaven and fold us in properly, the way it's folded in 40 other species before us." She tapped the table, once, hard. "But every system on this station that actually matters has years of undocumented, unpredictable, purely human decision-making baked into it. Splices nobody logged. Backups wired by people who are dead, or retired, or 3 systems away by now, in configurations that exist nowhere but here, inside these walls. If the Weave tries to model all of that simultaneously, in one massive pulse across everything at once instead of one careful system at a time, I don't think it converges cleanly the way it's used to. I think it breaks against us, the way it broke, in miniature, against one backup pump. Or it eats us whole and moves on to the next station down the line," said Thomas quietly, from his corner of the room. "You don't actually know which outcome we get, Naledi." "Neither do I, and I've read everything you've read." "No," Naledi admitted, meeting his eyes. "I don't know for certain. But I know what happened with 3 technicians and 1 backup pump. 4 minutes of failure to model a single system, out of hundreds we've got running. This is hundreds of systems, all wired the same stubborn, undocumented way, hitting their model all at once, simultaneously, with no time to isolate and adapt to each one individually the way they managed with Base 6. Renkis told us himself, the Weave doesn't tolerate unmodeled variables gracefully. We are not one unmodeled variable, Director. We are a station built almost entirely out of them, layered 20 years deep." The debate lasted long into the night, voices rising and falling around the little room, old grievances about past crises dragged up as evidence for one side or the other, Kip arguing too loudly for someone who kept insisting he didn't have an opinion, Thomas methodically poking holes in every version of the plan until Naledi had answered or absorbed every one of them. It was not resolved, in the end, by confidence so much as by the simple, exhausted absence of a better option on the table. Amara finally gave the order at 2 a.m, station time, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and something that was not quite fear, and not quite hope, but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two. "Don't resist the pulse," she told her staff, gathered now in the mess hall for an announcement that would reach every household on the station within the hour, relayed deck by people who trusted her more than they trusted the calm, reasonable voice that had been talking to them for the past week. Don't fight it, don't shut anything down in a panic, don't try to disconnect anything once it starts, no matter how strange it looks or how frightened you get watching it happen. Just be exactly what we already are. Nothing more, nothing less than what this station has always actually been, underneath the official paperwork. It was not a clean 18 hours. 4 hours in, while the station's engineering crews raced to document every last undisclosed splice and workaround they could find before the pulse arrived, a coolant line in Bay 3 let go under pressure it had been quietly failing to hold for months. And a young technician named Priya Anand went down hard, scalded along one arm before anyone could reach the shut-off valve. Naledi was 3 decks away when the alarm hit, and she ran the whole distance without letting herself think about what she might find at the other end of it. What she found was Thomas already there ahead of her, having moved faster than a man his age had any business moving, wrenching the manual bypass open with his bare hands while 2 junior techs dragged Priya clear of the worst of the escaping steam. It was not a clean rescue. It was not the kind of thing that would have looked impressive to anyone watching from outside, no coordinated protocol executed in perfect sequence, just 3 people improvising around each other in a space too small and too hot, shouting instructions that contradicted each other and somehow still adding up to the right outcome. Priya would keep the arm, the medic confirmed an hour later, though it would scar, and she would carry that scar, Naledi thought grimly, as one more thing this station had cost someone before it was done extracting its price for the day. Bad omen, Kip said afterward, pale, watching the medic work. It's not an omen, Naledi told him, though her voice was rougher than she meant it to be. It's a coolant line that's been on the replacement list for 8 months, because we never had the part, and never had the time. It's exactly what I've been trying to explain to everyone all week, Kip. This station runs on borrowed time and improvisation stacked 20 years deep, and sometimes the bill comes due at the worst possible moment. That's not luck. That's just what we are. She didn't say the rest of it out loud, not then, that the same borrowed, patched together, undocumented recklessness that had just cost Priya a scar was, if she was right, about to be the only thing standing between all 200 of them and whatever the cohort intended to do to a station it could no longer control. It felt obscene to hold both truths at once. She held them anyway, because there was no version of the next 14 hours where she got to set either one down. The 18 hours that followed passed in a strange, taut quiet unlike anything the lady had experienced on the station before, even during the famine year Thomas still wouldn't talk about in detail. Families gathered in the residential ring, doors left open between neighboring quarters in a way that hadn't happened since the last real emergency. Thomas shut down his fabrication floor entirely and simply sat beside the oldest machine on it, one hand resting flat on its housing like he was keeping vigil over something that might need him. Kip would not stop pacing the corridor outside Bay 9 until Naledi finally told him to sit down on an upturned crate and hold something heavy, which was, in its own strange way, exactly the kind of advice the station had always run on. And it worked. He went quiet almost immediately, gripping an old spare coupling like it was the only solid thing left in the universe. Naledi spent the final hour moving between 2 places, Bay 6, beside the water reclamation loop with its 8-month-old splice sitting exposed and unremarkable in its housing, and Bay 9, beside Vent 4, which had begun, faintly, unmistakably, to hum its wrong quarter tone again, as though it had been waiting the whole time for permission to start back up. She did not try to silence it this time. She crouched beside it in the low emergency lighting and let it hum, matching her own breathing to it without quite meaning to. At the appointed hour, the sky above Halliard changed color. It was not violent. There was no flash of weapons fire, no explosion, nothing a person watching from outside would have called an attack in any conventional sense. The 5 cohort ships simply extended their reach, hundreds, maybe thousands, of thin, near-invisible relay filaments, spreading down through the docking clamps and into the station's spine, into every conduit and junction and control line at once, exactly as promised, exactly on schedule, with the same terrible, patient courtesy Renkis had shown from the very first hour. For a moment, every light on Aldenhaven Station brightened in perfect, eerie unison, as if the whole structure had taken a single held breath and was waiting, along with everyone inside it, to see what came next. Then the humming started. Not just from vent 4. From everywhere, all at once, a rising chorus that seemed to come from inside the deck plating itself. It began as a system-wide vibration, a low resonant thrum running through the deck plates that made Nalady's teeth ache and set her fillings singing, and it built, over the following minutes, into something that no longer sounded mechanical at all, no matter how hard the ear tried to make sense of it that way. It sounded, unmistakably, and increasingly, like confusion. Like something enormous trying very hard to understand a sentence spoken in a language that kept changing its grammar mid-word. On the bridge, Amara watched readouts spike and stutter as the Weave's relay network attempted, in real time, across hundreds of channels simultaneously, to build a coherent model of Aldenhaven Station, and kept failing, because every path it traced led immediately into another undocumented splice, another workaround stacked on a workaround, another decision made 20 years ago by a person who was not thinking about efficiency or elegance at all, only about getting the air moving again. Before someone's shift ended and the temperature in the residential ring got dangerous. Renkes's voice came through the comm channel from its ship, and for the first time since it had walked off that vessel, it did not sound calm. Convergence is not stabilizing, it said, several voices badly out of sync now, fighting each other for the same words like instruments falling out of tune mid-performance. Repeat, convergence is not stabilizing across primary interface points. Requesting immediate cluster support from adjacent nodes, priority designation critical. A pause, filled with a static that had not been there in any of its earlier transmissions. Local model complexity exceeds. The word repeated itself 4 times before cutting off entirely, swallowed by noise. Because the Weave, Nalady understood now, standing in Bay 6 with her hand resting on the exposed panel, was not a single mind sitting comfortably outside the system it was trying to absorb, observing from a safe remove. It was a collective, a network of minds folded together across 40 species, and every one of those minds, in that moment, was reaching through the relay filaments toward Aldenhaven at once, trying to help resolve a discrepancy that only grew stranger and deeper the further into the station it reached. Each fix the station had ever improvised was itself built on top of another improvisation, a fractal mess of human stubbornness stretching back 2 decades in every direction, and the Weave, built from the ground up to find patterns and smooth them into predictable, gentle order, found instead an endless recursive tangle that refused, at every single layer it touched, to resolve into anything it could optimize, or even fully hold in its collective attention. In Bay 6, the water reclamation loop's miswired backup pump kicked on again, exactly the way it always had, exactly the way nothing in any cohort database anywhere said it should. Somewhere in the tangled feedback of the pulse, that single small unpredictable event rippled outward through the connected relays, forcing every linked node to recalculate its model from scratch. And in a network where every mind was joined to every other mind by the very design that made it powerful, that recalculation did not stay contained to one system, or one ship, or one bay. It spread, the way a single wrong note spreads through an orchestra that has never once had to improvise around a mistake. Down in the residential ring, Priya Anand sat, with her bandaged arm propped on a pillow, listening to the walls hum around her, and found she was not afraid so much as strangely comforted, the way you're comforted by thunder once you already know the storm can't reach you where you're sitting. In the mess hall, a dozen off-shift workers who had nowhere official to be had gathered anyway, the way people do when something enormous is happening just out of sight, and sat together in the dark with the lights flickering overhead, nobody saying much of anything, everybody listening to the deck plates the way Nalady had once taught half of them to listen without quite meaning to teach anyone anything at all. The deck shuddered hard enough that a wrench rolled off a nearby workbench and clattered across the floor, and somewhere down the corridor Nalady heard a young voice, Kipps, she realized, shout something that was more startled than afraid. She felt the deck shudder again under her boots and knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere older than reasoning, older than the 6 years she'd spent learning this station's every groan and quirk, that this was the moment her grandmother's bolt had been waiting for. She reached into her pocket and closed her hand around it, the wrong size, threaded for nothing on this station, kept for 20 years for no reason she had ever been able to name until right now, and she moved to the reclamation loop's exposed control panel, where a cohort relay filament had burrowed into the housing directly beside Dorsey's 8-month-old splice, glowing faint silver-white and trembling with the strain of trying to model something that refused to be modeled. There was no port for the bolt. No slot, no obvious purpose, nothing in any schematic that would call for it. She simply wedged it, by hand, into the narrow gap between two conduits that had never been designed to hold anything at all, jamming the relay filament's connection at an angle no engineer, human or otherwise, could ever have predicted from a diagram. It should not have mattered. One bolt, in one gap, in one system among hundreds currently screaming at each other through the same overloaded network. But the weave was not looking for a schematic anymore. It was looking, in that precise instant, for any stable pattern it could anchor itself against, something to hold onto amid the recursive chaos flooding in from every corner of the station at once. And the bolt, absurd and purposeless and utterly, defiantly unmodelable, was simply one more variable in a system already drowning in them, one drop too many in a cup that had been full for longer than anyone realized. The relay filament flared white, then dark, and the failure cascaded backward up the connection, through the docking clamp, into the ship above, and from there, along channels Naledi would never fully understand or need to, into the wider network waiting on the other end. Across the system, 5 cohort vessels went, one after another, dark against the stars. The silence afterward was the strangest part, stranger even than the humming had been. Aldenhaven's own systems flickered, stuttered, and slowly steadied, bruised in places, genuinely damaged in a handful of others that would take weeks of honest work to fully repair. But alive, run by the same patched-together tangle of decisions that had always kept it alive through worse than this. Above Halyard, the 5 cohort ships drifted, powerless, their running lights gone dark, their crews stranded in whatever passed, for a collective mind built on constant connection, as genuine shock. It took 11 hours for a skeleton crew from the lead vessel to restore enough local control to limp their ships to a safe holding distance. It took 3 days more for Renki's, subdued now, its several voices no longer quite as perfectly synchronized as they had been on that first afternoon, carrying a faint, permanent stutter that Naledi suspected would never fully resolve, to request, formally and without any trace of its earlier practice calm, a private conversation with Director Voss. "I do not fully understand what happened," Renki's admitted, standing once more in Bay 9, though this time it kept a careful, almost superstitious distance from the vent housings along the wall. "The Weave's diagnostic teams, spread across 3 sectors, are still working through the full scope of it, and I am told some of the disruption reached nodes that never came anywhere near your station directly. Early analysis suggests your station's infrastructure exists in a state of sustained, deliberate irregularity, lead irregularity compounding over years, such that no coherent behavioral model could ever fully stabilize against it, no matter how much capacity was brought to bear. When the Pulse attempted full integration, the resulting feedback did not merely fail to converge locally, the way it had in Bay 6. It propagated backward, through every connected node in range, disrupting portions of the wider weave that had never come near your station at all, and had no reason to expect any of this. "You tried to make us predictable," Amara said, standing with her arms loosely at her sides now instead of crossed, the fight gone out of her posture in a way that looked more like exhaustion than victory. "We've spent 20 years, on purpose and by necessity both, making sure we never were. So I am beginning to understand, slowly, and at considerable cost." Renki's was quiet for a moment, the pause stretching longer than any it had allowed itself before. "The Weave has withdrawn its invitation of harmonization. Permanently, and, I am authorized to add, in the interest of the honesty I owe you at this point, with a formal recommendation now filed with the Concordat Assembly that Aldenhaven Station be classified as structurally incompatible with integration protocols, and left entirely to its own governance without further contact of this kind, from us or I suspect, from anyone else who reads the incident report carefully. That easy? Nothing about the last 3 days has been easy, Director, for either of us, in ways I doubt I can fully explain even now. Something in Renkes's tone, layered and strange as it still was, carried what Naledi thought might have been the closest thing to genuine feeling she had heard from it yet, standing there in the low light of a bay it had once tried to quietly rewire without asking. I have served the weave for longer than your station has existed in its current form. I have never once seen it afraid of anything, in all that time. It is afraid of you now. Not your weapons, you have none worth the name, and we both know it. It is afraid of the simple fact that you cannot be known in advance, no matter how closely it looks, and that is not a threat the weave has ever had to build an answer for. When the Cohort ships finally departed, 3 weeks later, moving slowly and carefully like something that had learned real caution the hard way, the message that reached the Concordat assembly through Renkes's channels was considerably less neutral than Speaker Torvain's usual careful phrasing. Word of what had happened at a 200-person mining station spread through channels the assembly did not control nearly as tightly as it liked to believe, passed ship to ship along the trade lanes the way real news always traveled faster than official reports. Torvain himself called 2 weeks after that, his tired face filling the comms screen with an expression Naledi hadn't seen on him before, something closer to genuine unease than the practiced neutrality he usually wore like a uniform. I want to be clear, he said, that the assembly took no position either for or against your station during the incident, and bears no responsibility for. Speaker, Amara cut in, not unkindly, nobody's asking you to apologize. We are not filing a grievance. We are telling you what happened so it's on record, in case somebody else's invitation shows up on somebody else's doorstep next year. She paused. Though I'll admit, it might have been nice to hear from you at all, during those 18 hours, instead of after. Torvain had no good answer for that, and to his credit, he didn't try to invent one. Within a month, 4 other small, overlooked colonies along the fringe had quietly reached out to Aldenhaven directly, bypassing the assembly's channels entirely, asking not for protection exactly, but for something closer to advice. How do you build a place too strange, too stubborn, too full of undocumented decisions, to ever be swallowed whole? Amara fielded most of those calls herself, patient and blunt in equal measure, and more than once Naledi found herself pulled in to explain, to strangers on colonies she would likely never visit, the shape of a philosophy she'd never once had to put into words before this year. It was harder than fixing a vent. She was, she discovered, not nearly as good at explaining the thing as she was at simply doing it, and she suspected that was fine. Some things were like that. Naledi did not have a clean answer for them, and she suspected she never fully would, not one that fit tidily into a single transmission. What she had, instead, was a station that still hummed a little wrong in places, and had quietly stopped bothering to fix every last one of those wrongnesses on principle, because she had finally understood, in a way she couldn't have explained to her younger self, what they were actually for. Months later, working the same shift, under the same vent housing in Bay 9, she found herself teaching Kip a repair that had no manual entry anywhere in the station's records. A fix she was building up as she went, using a spare part that did not officially belong in that system according to any schematic, because it was what was on hand, and it would probably work. And if it didn't, she'd improvise something else the way she always had. You're just guessing, Kip said, watching her hands move with a confidence that clearly did not match the words coming out of his own mouth. I'm building something nobody else could predict, Naledi said, not looking up from the panel. Same thing, out here, whether you call it guessing or engineering. Just depends who's asking, and how badly they need an answer that fits on a form. She reached into her pocket, out of old habit, for a bolt that was no longer there, spent now, wedged forever into a conduit in Bay 6 that nobody, not even Renkes's own diagnostic teams, during their brief, careful follow-up visit, had ever quite managed to fully explain, doing more good stuck uselessly in place than it had ever done rattling loose in her pocket for 20 long years. She smiled, faintly, at the empty space where it used to sit, and reached for a different spare instead, already turning it over in her fingers, already wondering what it might be useful for, someday, if she just carried it long enough. The vent hummed on, a quarter tone off, exactly the way it was always supposed to.